Welcome back to Historical Context. Today we're continuing with the De Soto Expedition, Part 2. And in our last episode, if you haven't listened or watched, you should go back and take a look. We talk about how De Soto gets to Apalache, where the Narvaez expedition last was. Narvaez cut west and went out over the Gulf of Mexico. De Soto has decided to head further north into the wilderness of the southeastern United States. The expedition, after wintering in Apalachia, leaves on March 3rd, 1540. They pack maize and they expect to travel through 60 leagues of desert. That is either what they have heard or what they're anticipating. So they think that the Georgia landscape is desert. Members of the expedition carried their own food and supplies because captive natives died in large numbers over the winter. On March 11th, they arrive in their first town, which is in modern-day Georgia, and the natives there abandon the town. The next day, some natives were actually found hiding, and they attacked the group, where one member of the expedition was killed and 3 were wounded. The expedition leaves this town, and they describe in the writing that they, quote, passed through a desert, which is interesting. And they arrive at another town on March 21st, which is located in the central part of Georgia. There, the writer notes a difference in the appearance of the houses. Let's have a look. The houses of this town were different from those behind, which were covered with dry grass, roofed with cane, after the fashion of tile. Some have their sides so made of clay as to look like tapia. Throughout the cold country, every Indian has a winter house, plastered inside and out, with a very small door which is closed at dark, and a fire being made within. It remains heated like an oven, so that clothing is not needed during the nighttime. He has likewise a house for summer, and near it a kitchen where fire is made and bread baked. So the houses have a little bit more distinct appearance here. They appear to be a little more permanent. They also appear to have seasonal homes to deal with the change in seasons. They left. After a few days, they come on to another town. The natives, having never seen Europeans before, in an effort to escape, actually dove into a nearby stream to try to get away. A few of the natives ended up being captured. De Soto tells the chief of this village that he was a child of the sun seeking the richest providence. The chief tells De Soto that there is a town called Ocute, and he provides a guide, a native, to help De Soto get to the town. In exchange for this guide, De Soto releases some of the native prisoners that he captured in that village. Before leaving, De Soto adds one final task. Let's have a look. A high cross made of wood was set up in the middle of the town yard, and as time did not allow more to be done, the Indians were instructed that it was put there to commemorate the suffering of Christ, who was God and man, that he had created the skies and the earth and had suffered for the salvation of all, and therefore that they should revere that sign, and they showed by their manner that they would do so. So this is the first time I'm recalling something like this happening. Obviously nothing was built by prior expeditions, so this cross is created and left there. De Soto leaves, and on April 10th, he reaches Ocute, where he was greeted by gifts of food and greeted by a population of 2,000 natives. From there, they continue on, having not found any gold, and stop at another town. And then, leaving that town, a man on the expedition has a seizure and is foaming at the mouth. So what does the expedition do? Well, they're fearing that the man is possessed, so they conduct an exorcism, and the seizure goes away. So if you're ever on Jeopardy and they ask you about the first exorcism in the lower 48 states, you could tell them it was the DeSoto expedition in 1540. So they continue on for another town, and the journey is taking way longer than what they anticipated. DeSoto's getting mad, and he is about to actually have this guide murdered. But Juan Ortiz, remember Juan Ortiz from the last episode, he steps in and begs for the life of this guide, and DeSoto spares his life because of Juan Ortiz. But that doesn't help the situation with low supplies and low food. The men of the expedition begin to starve, and they are declining physically, and they're trying to find this town that they're looking for. But they do have a food source. Let's have a look. The governor had brought 13 sows to Florida, which had increased to 300 swine. And the maize having failed for 3 or 4 days, he ordered to be killed daily. For each man, half a pound of pork, on which small allowance, and some boiled herbs. The people with much difficulty lived. So these sows or swine, which had clearly multiplied over the last 8 or 9 months, had now become the food source of the expedition. Now, DeSoto must have been feeding the natives, because as the food got scarce, he decided to release them. On April 26th, they reached the town of Ame, where they meet a female chief who presents them with clothing from their village. Now, if you'll recall, that young boy, which we don't know what happened to him, had talked about a female chief and a large kingdom. So they continue on, and they find another town that had been abandoned due to an insect infestation. So they keep going. Next village, they asked where gold and riches may be found, and the natives give them a name of another village. So essentially, this has turned into the southeastern United States 16th century scavenger hunt, where a clue leads to another clue leads to another clue. We get into the month of May. The female chief from Ame had been taken with other natives against their will, and for 7 days they would stop at these villages, and through the female chief would give orders to the natives, which were obeyed. And this is interesting, because it kind of confirms what that boy had talked about, that this chief had carry over multiple villages. Now, what gets interesting here is the differences between the towns. In one town, which they traveled to next, the natives there lived mostly off of roots, and they were hunters who shot animals as well. But then they went to the next town, right next door, and the natives there had an abundance of turkeys, and provided many of them to the expedition. And it makes you wonder whether or not these natives engaged in trade with each other. Sometimes you think you're inclined to say yes, because at least they were able to spread word of mouth about the expedition coming in. But part of me wonders that may not have happened, because why would that village have ample turkeys to just give away to other people if they were engaged in trade? They continue to mention, as they're going along, desert areas in their travels. And I found this interesting because desert in Georgia didn't really jive with me, and I'd never heard that before. So I went online and looked this up, because it is just mentioned prolifically throughout the writing. And it turns out that they were in the beginning of the Piedmont Plateau, which is a little bit more of an arid area. It's dry. It doesn't have a lot of vegetation, and it runs from Georgia into South Carolina, which is where they're now moving into, and it would be, from a Spanish point of view, considered a desert. So they're crossing into South Carolina. The female chief escapes with 3 other natives, and 2 of those natives would return, but the female chief did not come back, and the expedition continued on without her. They go town to town through South Carolina, very, in the writings, just nonchalant. Either they're welcomed or they're not welcomed. There wasn't any major battles, no references to massive amounts of natives being taken prisoner or anything like that. They just kind of keep going town to town as they're going through the Carolinas. We talked about how in one town they were given turkeys, in another town they were presented with mulberries. And so now they're in modern day North Carolina. And on July 5th, they arrive at the town of Chiaha, which is actually believed to be close to the North Carolina-Tennessee border. So they're really coming into the southeastern United States. This ends up being the leg of the journey where they go furthest north. The chief in this town was very accommodating. The village had, of all things, lard that the natives told the expedition came from bears. The village also had walnut oil and honeycombs, even though, and this is mentioned in the writing, nobody saw any bees. The expedition rests here for 30 days, and they rested that long because the horses were getting tired from traveling and had deteriorated going through the dry plateau, and they needed to build up their energy. I note as I was reading this that this seemed to be a little bit of a distinction from the Narvaez expedition, where they just kind of ground it out and kept going. And I think that this was key to them being able to travel as far as they did and go as far as they did without getting desperate. So after the 30 days pass, all of their natives that are in captivity escaped, and the chief there in the village went to De Soto apologetically. De Soto, upset at the natives leaving, actually goes in pursuit of them, and he destroys fields of maize as he goes. Again, not quite the Goodwill expedition here. He then arrives at Coste, which is a village, again, on that border there between Tennessee and North Carolina, and then starts to move south because he wants to get away from the Appalachian Mountains. So De Soto is in an area that is a little bit more elevated, but where he is now becomes high ridge mountains. And had the Appalachian not been there, the Appalachian Mountains, one must wonder how much further inland he would have gone. And it would have been interesting because as you get to those points, the winters, if you think they're bad in northern Florida, they're brutal in Tennessee, Kentucky, and going further north compared to those of Florida. So he's heading south. He goes through another town and takes more natives prisoner, stays there, continues south, and ends up back in northern Georgia. From northern Georgia, they had an incident where one of the men of the expedition is out hunting for grapes and never returns. And I note this because we don't know what we're going to come across in future episodes or expeditions. That's not making a promise that we're going to find this man, but again, lost people, there's a chance that they could assimilate. However, we are talking about a guy that's burning everything and taking people captivity as he goes, not really making any friends, and so this lost man was probably murdered. But again, we'll leave that open for speculation. So they're cutting back through northern Georgia, and now they're getting to the Alabama border, and they go town to town into Alabama with, again, very little issues going on. as they're going town to town, I would suggest that DeSoto is probably taking and releasing natives from captivity. Because at one point he gets to a swollen river, and DeSoto asks the natives who live there for canoes. And the natives exclaim that they do not have canoes, but they had rafts. And I want to make a distinction here because we're up in central Alabama. If you go down to the coastline of Florida and you ask for a canoe, natives would have canoes. They have taken large tree trunks and hollowed them out into canoes. We learned that from an earlier episode. But up here in central Alabama, where the water is more rivers and streams, they just take logs and tie them together to make rafts. So that's an important distinction if you're wanting to know more about the natives of the southeastern United States. So the natives lend rafts for the expedition to float across this swollen river. And now we're getting into October. We're getting close to winter. And the expedition comes to another town. A chief that DeSoto has taken with him separates from the group and refuses to go any further. And when I say he separates from the group, I'm not saying he just runs off, but he separates from the group in the writing and then starts arguing with DeSoto and says, "We're not going any further." An argument continues and a fight breaks out. 5 Europeans are killed in this fight as the natives are attacking the members of the expedition, and DeSoto himself barely escapes getting out of the town. The uprising spreads when the natives that were released and captured natives catch up to the expedition armed with bows and arrows. Additionally, when DeSoto escaped this village, some of his weapons were left behind and they were seized by the native tribe. So if you want to go back into Native American history and look at when the first time natives used European-style weapons, it was likely in this incident in 1540. In the town where this uprising occurred, a friar and a priest were left behind in a house, and they were actually hiding in this house. The natives, as they're clearing the town, come across this, and they're unable to get into this house because the priest and the friar are barricaded in it. So the natives begin to tear the roof off of this house. And the only thing that stopped them from getting in and likely killing these two individuals was that DeSoto's expedition returned and began to attack the town. So DeSoto decides to do a counterattack. DeSoto surrounds the town and starts burning it to the ground. The friar and the priest end up being saved, but 2 other members of the expedition were killed rescuing them. As natives were cornered by the Europeans, instead of being recaptured, they opted to throw themselves into their burning houses. So that tells you all you need to know about what the natives felt regarding captivity. They'd rather burn to death. It was estimated that 2,500 natives died in this incident, and 18 members of the expedition were lost. And at this point, the author of this writing, who was a Portuguese sailor just being a part of the expedition, he recounts that now a total of 102 members of the expedition have died. The group rests, and on November 18th they head out and now are in western Alabama. At one town, a river separates the expedition from the natives that are on the other side. And the natives on the other side begin to verbally yell at the expedition and make threatening gestures towards them. Well, DeSoto's men they pretty much didn't care. They crossed the river anyways. And they get there, and the threat level dies down, so there is no fighting. And the chief reports that a neighboring town has rebelled against him, and he requests DeSoto's help, and DeSoto agrees. He decides to send men to help this chief put down a rebellion in a neighboring town. And I think this goes to kind of show that while they were fighting amongst tribes, they were also fighting within tribes. DeSoto's men get to this rebelling village, only finding it abandoned and burned to the ground. And again, people are having advanced warning that this expedition is coming, and they're not carrying a very good reputation. However, DeSoto does extend, I wouldn't necessarily say an olive branch. We'll call it an olive branch, but if we're going to say that, we're also going to say a stick came right behind it. Let's have a look at the writing. The governor invited some chiefs to dine with him, giving them pork to eat, which they so relished, although not used to it, that every night Indians would come up to some houses where the hogs slept to kill and carry away what they could of them. 3, that is natives, were taken in the act. 2 the governor commanded to be slain with arrows, and the remaining one, his hands having first been cut off, was sent to the chief, who appeared grieved that they had given offense and glad that they were punished. So an interesting situation there of extending hospitality. The natives then tried to steal from the Europeans, and they were punished. Some very, very old school justice there with hands being cut off. Shortly after this incident, 4 Europeans go into the native village and are caught stealing goods. The chief was furious about this. So does DeSoto give these men the same justice that he gave the natives? Well, he condemns 2 of the men to death. And at the execution, one of the prisoners appeals to Juan Ortiz, the interpreter, to help him. And the prisoner comes up with this idea to have Juan Ortiz mess up the translation, which Ortiz does. He tells the natives that the men would be punished, and he tells DeSoto that the natives were not offended by this action. And so the men end up getting released. It's quite a fascinating little story there about how these 2 men had their lives spared. They would end up in this location wintering, so they'd stay there through the winter. And in early March, they're getting ready to leave. But as they approach and discuss with the natives what's going on, again, they've been living with them for 3-4 months, and they discuss with the natives what they're wanting to do, they become concerned by the natives' demeanor. And the author doesn't go into any more detail here, but it just seems like something was rubbing them the wrong way, and they had reason to be concerned. That night, the natives attacked the expedition. They charged into the encampment, and unfortunately for the expedition, the 3 watchmen that were supposed to do their job fled, and the natives set fire to the houses that the members of the expedition were staying in. There was a ton of chaos, and in that ensuing chaos, you had a ton of things going on. Men were trying to get armed. Their horses were penned up, and actually many of them burned to death in their stalls. And ultimately, the encampment is burned to the ground, and 40 men are killed. So not a good spot for DeSoto and the expedition to be before moving on. And so what do they end up doing? We'll find out next week in the conclusion of the DeSoto expedition on Historical Context.